Okay, so I kind of made notes as I was listening to everyone else's videos, and so I'm just going to um, reply kind of all in one. In response to Alex, I don't actually watch the news. We don't have cable. I tend to get most of my news from social media. Um, I have the additional context of following or being friends with a lot of activists and current or former journalists, which means that I get fairly decent. Sorry, someone texted me. Fairly decent quality. And then I follow the links. Um, but Grace said later that you remembered Arab Spring fairly vividly, but not much mention on mainstream media of the social media involvement. I don't remember it being mentioned in mainstream media either. I was living in Canada at the time, and it was sort of touched on CBC, but I was following a lot of it on Twitter, which is still where I go for a lot of breaking news, because the response is faster, and kind of the aggregate of information um, provides more accuracy than going to any single news outlet. Obviously, you still have to evaluate it for individual reliability, but I remember, oh, I forget her name. In Texas, she was filibustering the stupid bill. But like at the time, MSNBC was doing a segment on muffins, and all of it was on Twitter. And um, like the reason the AP got a screenshot of lawmakers changing a date stamp and doing illegal shit was because people were on Twitter, and there was enough outcry on Twitter that an intern at the AP got a screenshot. Um, so I definitely think social media is really important um, for any kind of protest. My next note in sequence here is for Grace. I don't think Arab Spring happened quickly because Tabriz was founded in 1998, and that was like 13 years before everything boiled over. And I think a lot of it was just a lot of discontent finally coming to a point. Um, and the internet shutdown was such a bad decision on the part of the government. Um, Internet shutdowns always spark rage, and part of it is the fact that internet is how we connect with people, and you're suddenly shutting down all connections. Like Romeo and Juliet did not respond well to having their connection and ability to speak to each other severed. Um, and sudden censorship definitely sparked more. Um, like the Hong Kong protests. The government desperately shut down internet all over the city, but partly because of the legacy of Arab Spring, there was software, FireChat, which is produced by Open Garden. It creates a mesh network which lets people still communicate on the ground, which allowed people to still organize even though the internet was shut down. So the government was trying to like severely cripple their ability to organize and warn people and get news out. I'll post a link to the article about FireChat because it's a really cool program and was surprisingly important. Um, and like part of that was there are a lot of tech savvy young people involved, and young people always end up really involved in revolution. I think largely because they have less to lose, less property. High unemployment. Um, Fewer people will have kids. So it makes it easier to be willing to give up everything because you don't have as much of a solid stake. So you can make your stake more ideal based because you're the only person you are sacrificing as you chase your ideals. Um, but again, all of the technology involved and all of the cool innovation that people have been doing to make organizing protests easier, it doesn't matter unless people show up. Netflix has a really cool documentary of The Square, about Egypt in particular and Tahrir Square, because having a central geographic location was also really important. Um, One of the reasons protesting in the US is so hard is because we have such um, a diaspora of people. Like, and then beyond that, New York is our big city that we think of, but government is in DC. So, I mean, that right there makes geographic organization harder. Um, but people showing up and like having that kind of backing was one of the reasons I hated change.org for years, because it encouraged people to feel like just doing something online was activism while not actually being connected to anything. I mean, now they are paired with petitions.whitehouse.gov, so they are significantly more likely to be effective. But there was years and years where they weren't. I mean, the partnership with petitions.whitehouse.gov is from last year. Um, and I think having all of the protests on Facebook, and particularly having an English language Facebook page, helped make it harder to disappear people. It helped raise global awareness, which isn't necessarily hugely important for the local thing, but I think it definitely helped the snowball effect that Arab Spring had. And I know that there were people in Egypt sharing images on Twitter and Facebook to help bolster morale in Ferguson. Um, and and that was, I mean, I think that it's important to know what's going on in our country and like how it mirrors this stuff that we're able to examine as, you know, revolution against dictatorship and police brutality. Which brings me back to if I see something, I like to think that I would record it. I mean, that is the reason I carried my phone with me when I was out in Russia most of the time, despite the fact that I didn't have service. I mean, I was taking pictures of all of the cool stuff too, but like that's the reason I had my phone with me and not just a camera. I do not have a world phone. I got no signal whatsoever. Sorry, just looking over my notes again. Valerie, you mentioned your friends with duplicate accounts. And I'm not sure why they do that in particular, but I have a couple of professor friends who maintain social media identities that are completely separate so that they can have fandom stuff and professional stuff. Because they're worried about professional sanctions for basically for having fun and not being 100% dignified 100% of the time. I also know someone who works in inpatient mental health for at-risk young people, who, for all of her creative writing, maintains a very separate identity because it could compromise her job. And I mean, I think separate accounts and some degree of anonymity are not only excusable but necessary when you're worried about sanctions. I mean, there's a reason Fetus and Waterman stayed anonymous, and that's fear of sanctions. And I mean, losing your job and arrest and torture are separate stakes, but I think it's largely of a piece. But yeah, this is something I have a lot of feelings about, obviously.